You're watching Classic Ed, and in this video I'm going to be changing the injector seals on this 1972 Mercedes 350 SL. So if you suspect that your injector seals may be leaking, i.e. sucking in excess air at idle, one thing you can do is take some starting fluid or leak detection fluid or even just carb cleaner, spray it close down to where the injector seals are, and if you get a rise in RPM, then that suggests that the fluid is being sucked in past the seals and combusting in the engine, which obviously it shouldn't be, because the seals should stop anything from being sucked in that area. Now, when I did this on this car earlier with the engine running, I thought I could detect a slight rise. Nothing too dramatic. It was inconclusive, to be honest, but the other thing that kind of prompted me to want to do this job was that I could see there was a lot of dirt and grit and everything around the injectors, and particularly since I'm hoping to do the valves in the near future, do a valve adjustment, because this is a pre-hydraulic lifter car. That was a good idea, to clean around the injectors such that when I take the valve covers off, all the dirt doesn't just sort of fall into the valve train. And you can't really clean that area where the manifold where the manifold joins the head properly without taking the fuel rails off. So, having decided to go ahead with the job, the first step was to take the airbox off. Gives you much better access to the fuel rail, have a look at all the fuel hoses and go from there. Airbox is off, and here are injectors. So on the D-Jetronic system, you don't have a central fuel distributor like you do on K-Jetronics. There's no spider web on the top of the manifold here. It's just a simple fuel circuit which goes around the top of the engine. You've got the pressure regulator, you've got the return line, and you've got the damper here as well. It's pretty simple. The injectors are connected, 4 on each side, obviously one for each cylinder, to the metal fuel rail, and then the corners of the circuit, as it were, are rubber. You've also got the cold start injector up here, but we don't need to worry about that for this purpose. I think there are seals on the cold start injector as well, but I'm not going to do that as part of this job. Each injector has a seal on it, which I'll demonstrate in a bit, which effectively seals around the nozzle, between the nozzle and the hole in the head of the engine, that through which the injectors are placed, such that they can spray fuel into the cylinders. And then you also have what is sometimes referred to as an upper seal or an upper guide, which is more of actually just a rubber ring, a rubber grommet, which goes around the mid portion of the body of each injector and essentially acts as an insulating barrier between the bracket, the metal bracket which holds each injector in place and is bolted into the top of the manifold, and the body of the injector itself. Now, those upper seals, or upper guides as they're sometimes called, it's not so critical that they be changed, but I'm going to change them anyway as part of this job, because some of them were showing some evidence of a bit of heat damage. But the main reason for changing your lower seals, the ones that are actually around the nozzle of the injectors, is that they tend to crack and harden with age, and as a result they can sometimes let air in past the seals, which will obviously effectively gives you a vacuum leak, possibly causes the engine to suck in excess air more than it should do. And if you're getting a lumpy idle, or an idle that's just a bit unstable, and or maybe you're struggling to set the idle consistently, if you've already eliminated your auxiliary air valve as being the problem, then the injector seals are probably the next thing to look at, because they can be a source of excess air, and without them being sealed properly, you're always going to struggle to set the idle. So parts and tools wise, not a huge amount required. The injectors on this car have a Bosch model number of 0280150034 and have yellow plastic on the body.
I'm not sure, but it's possible that the seals might be slightly different if you have a different injector model number. There was some variation in the early years of D-Jetronic, so check that before ordering. These are the lower seals, go around the nozzle, and this is the upper guide rubber that goes under the mounting bracket. I also needed some replacement pintle caps because the injectors on the left side of the engine were missing them. So the pintle cap is this little plastic cap that goes over the metal nozzle, and it's designed to protect the very fine atomizing pin on the end of the injector from being snapped off or bent during installation. It's designed to be fitted to the injector for the life of the injector, for the injector to function with it fitted, and the injector will function perfectly adequately, I think, without them. But there is a risk during reinstallation that you might catch the little metal pin on the aperture and the head, for example. So it's a good idea, if you are missing any, to replace them just to avoid that risk. I got some replacements from Master Injector UK. They seem like quite a good resource for classic fuel injection systems. They also offer a refurbishment service and also other bits that I didn't go into on this job, but you could, for example, replacement fuel hose, various other washers, and also the filters that are inside the injector. You could do those as well. Again, links will be provided. The other thing I did was I changed some of the fuel clamps around the rubber bits that connect to the different bits of the fuel rail. So someone had used Jubilee clamps, or worm clamps, I think they're sometimes called in North America, throughout the fuel system. That's not correct. You should use one of these threaded clamps that's actually advertised as a fuel hose clamp that has a thread on it, you know, using a little bolt or something rather than a worm gear. It's to do with the way that they like bite into the hose and potentially damage it and apply an uneven pressure around it. So I swapped all those out. I got some from the SL shop. You can just get some from Halfords as well. They're perfectly fine. Just make sure they have that design on them. You also want a few replacement cable ties, just because the wiring loom for the injectors is cable tied in a couple of places to the metal bit of the fuel rail. So obviously you have to cut that off to get the rail off the engine, so we replace those. And then tool wise, the injectors are held on via a metal bracket that is secured to the manifold with some studs with a nut, and those are 10mm nuts, so you need a 10mm socket for those, suitable extension, and obviously a ratchet. Cylinders 5 and 6, the access was a little bit difficult to the securing nuts because the idle air circuit kind of obstructed them, so I actually needed a 10mm spanner to get in there to loosen them, and then go in once they were loose and just get them off by hand. And then circlip pliers, ideally you should have these for the replacement of these guys. I couldn't find these at the time that I actually did the job, so I improvised slightly with holding and held the fuel rail in a vise, while also using these two little metal picks to kind of perform a circlip-like action on the clip that needed releasing. I'll demonstrate that later on in the video. The other thing, though, that this pick was very useful for, these little seals, when you take the rail out with the injectors, quite often the seals will stay behind in the head because they're just fused in there from years of heat and etc. This pick, if you stick it inside of the hole and kind of stab it into the inside of the seal, you can then hook it out quite nicely, and that worked really well. And then on the clamps, most of the time these will have a 7mm bolt head, so a 7mm socket is best for tightening them. I mean, obviously you can use a screwdriver if you want, but a socket is always superior in my opinion. And then just some penetrating fluid just to loosen the studs on the manifold. I used a carb cleaner just to give the injectors a little clean, and also just clean up the area around the head of the manifold where the injectors seat, because it was very dirty, lots of horrible grit, and it was difficult to sort of stop it from falling into the engine. Lots of microfiber cloths, kitchen roll, etc., something to block up the holes in the head while the injectors are out, and also a vacuum cleaner was very handy. I should also add, best to have a fire extinguisher nearby, particularly when you go to start the car for the first time after having completed the job. I found in my case I hadn't quite tightened one of the fuel hoses tight enough and got quite a severe leak actually the first time I started the car after doing this, which obviously could have turned nasty. So I always keep a fire extinguisher in the car anyway actually, so it's good to have one of those to hand.
So the engine's been off for some time, plus I also know that the car's not holding fuel pressure very well at the moment, so I'm not going to bother to turn the engine over with the fuel supply shut off. Obviously if you want to do that, then take out the fuel pump relay is probably the easiest way of doing that, and then turn the engine over a bit. It might start and then run for a little bit, or it might not start at all. Doesn't really matter, but in this case, because the pressure I know pretty sure is going to be non-existent, I'm just going to put cloth underneath the ends of the rails here and just take those off. And yeah, hardly any fuel in there at all. On the rail you've got two little brackets for the wiring loom to be attached. Now because I'm going to lift the rail out in its entirety, obviously those need to be cut and you know, replaced on reinstallation. Very careful just to cut the plastic here and not cut into the braided wire underneath it. Okay. I'm going to disconnect the individual lines to the injectors. Obviously you want to note which line goes to which one. The plastic boots on them. Just going to let all them off. And one was quite stiff. I hope I haven't damaged that. No, I think we're good. Right, 10mm socket. And immediately I can see there is a lot of debris around the injector holes there, so that's all going to have to be cleaned up. Let's give a slightly better view here of what we're talking about. So here are our injector holes, and yes, you can see this one, for example, is definitely the remnants of a seal left behind. That one, cylinder number 1, has come out cleanly. Get some carb cleaner here and just spray it a little bit, just so we have something on this. Just scratch. Right, let's give this guy a go. Well, that's the guy to use. Now the only real difference with the other side is that you've also got the cold start injector to disconnect. Just having a good look at the condition of the rubber hoses on this side as well. This hose at the end here looks fairly new, but it does have a Jubilee clip on it. It's hose here to the cold start injector itself, that looks a bit older. Again, Jubilee clip on, so I'm a bit dubious about who's done that. While you're at it, actually check your manifold ground here, because that can be, if that's loose or corroded, I think that can confuse the ECU and is a common issue, you know, for if the system isn't firing or it's misbehaving or something like that, then that ground is a prime suspect. So I'm just going to give you a better shot there of that ground on the manifold, this guy here. And yeah, you've got a cold start injector pipe just there. So the nuts for the cylinders 5 and 6 on the manifold are kind of underneath the idle air circuit pipe work on this car. One little thing I will just point out about the left-hand fuel rail, it's slightly harder to disconnect it at the front end than the right hand side, because you've got this, or on this car at least, configuration may vary of course depending on exactly how you know, model year and all, but on this car you've got this short rubber pipe here, but you've also got this metal pipe here, and there's a pipe that comes off the bottom of that and goes down the front there, and it's just held to the front of the block by that bracket, and obviously you don't want to pull on that metal pipe too much because you're going to bend the vertical bit of it as it goes down, so just be careful when doing that. So this is actually the left-hand fuel rail, but it'll be a bit more fluid for me to explain it having done the right-hand one. The only thing that's tricky about getting the upper seals off is that they have this C-clip, or whatever you want to call it, that holds the upper seal in place, and what you really want are some good needle nose pliers to separate those. Now unfortunately my needle nose pliers were a bit too big to go in the holes, so I improvised using these 2 picks, I guess you'd call them, and what you want to do, what I did, is carefully insert them upwards, and it has to be upwards. If you put them down they'll just slip off. So insert them up through the little holes like that, and then with some care we can separate and pull, and off it comes. Well, first of all, give the injector a good clean, because it'll have lots of grit on it, or may have lots of grit on it. Certainly this one did. Partly because a certain amount of grit had got past the lower seal, past both seals, but also partly because, particularly with the left fuel rail, it was very difficult to not get a bit of kind of grit on the injectors as they came out, because there was a certain amount of sort of, you had to wriggle them around a little bit but what you don't want obviously is to make that worse, because when you come to take the rubber bit off, as I'm doing now, what you don't then want to do is move even more of that grit around towards the nozzle. Come here. There we go. And then again, there's no special trick to these particularly. I'm just gonna... Now I'm using carb cleaner to do this, which is obviously fine for metal parts, but rubber is not such a fan. So just, you know, be careful that you make sure you dry it all off before putting the new seal on. You can take off the bracket as well and give that a clean when you're at it.
Just put the bracket back on, rest it there. New seal. And it should go on without any lubrication. There we go. Right, and now to put our clip back on. So this time you want the spikes, the hooks I should say, pointing down. Obviously the force is going in a different direction now, so here we go. Just get it in. Gets underneath the metal ridge of the injector, such that it sort of sits there. It'll be a little bit loose, but that's fine. It's just to stop the seal from being pushed any further down the injector than it should be. So these are the pintle caps that I mentioned earlier. Got them from Master Injector UK off eBay. They also have a website which I will leave a link to in the description. So we take our injector and the pintle cap just goes on the end like that, and it is going to be quite a snug fit. Firmly hold the injector, put pressure over it, and then it should just push on like that. Don't use any tool or anything like that, because the danger is, although that metal protrusion should be just kind of level with the end of the cap, obviously the danger is if you try to use a hammer or pliers or something like that, you might bend the metal protrusion, which obviously you don't want. Whereas the palm of your hand is unlikely to do any damage to it. So this is the style of seal I ordered from the SL shop. The ones from Master Injector UK, if you order the seals as well from them, they might be slightly different, but they should all fit. The key thing being that they're a nice snug fit now with the pintle cap on. So whereas before they were a bit loose, which obviously defeats the point, and it's not going to seal properly around the hole. Now, opinions seem to vary as to whether it's better to put the seal on the injector or whether to put it in the hole in the manifold. I think it's easier to put it on the injector first, because that is quite a snug fit, and if I put it in the manifold, I would be a little bit concerned as to whether it actually had seated properly, whereas the thicker bit, which seats with the hole, is I think a bit easier to seat. It's not quite as tight, whereas that bit is round the pintle cap is tight. So I think it's better to put them on the injector first. And certainly that's what I did with the right hand rail, and they went back in the car as far as I'm aware perfectly fine, no issues at all. All right, line up the cold start injector, line up the main rail, and this is why it's good to have those pintle caps on. Actually, it just stops also will, they will perform their intended purpose of protecting the ends of the injectors. Oh, you're fucking around with this. Yeah, see the rails are already starting to look a bit more seated now, which is good. There we go. So the new seals are fatter, and which is good, because that means they're actually going to seal around the, around the hole, the ports.
And again, these don't have to be super tight. You sort of reach a point on the stud where it just won't really turn any further, and that's the point to stop. Right, I think we're all good. All our hoses are tight, all our injectors are back in and plugged back in. So she started up fine, but we had a big fuel leak from this corner of the rail here, so I'm just going to take that bit off again and investigate why that started leaking, because the hose there seems to be in good condition, but it might be I've just not pushed it on the pipe far enough, I don't know, or maybe there's a crack in it somewhere. Thankfully I do have some spare hose now that I can change it if necessary. So thankfully it transpired that I just hadn't tightened one of the hose clamps enough at the back of the rail. I took the pipe off after it leaked the first time just to make sure it didn't have any cracks or ruptures in it, but it looked fine. It was actually one of the younger pipes on the younger hoses on the circuit. So put it back on, tightened it up nice and firmly, and it hasn't leaked since, and the idle is now nice and stable. So just a final comment to close the video. You may have heard me mention earlier on about the auxiliary air valve. Now this is a job that I did before doing the injector seals, but I'll address it in a future video. And certainly if you've got a bad idle, particularly a surging idle when the car's cold, that's where I would go first before doing the injector seals. So stay tuned for my thoughts on this guy.